The modern-day Hollywood studio system is not exactly a system known for its artistic integrity. Quite the opposite, in fact.
You better hold on tight, Spider Monkey.
You don't have to look far to find an example of a recent blockbuster movie that feels like it was written by 25 different people, all with their own idea of how to appeal to every possible demographic. And that's because that's genuinely how a lot of tentpole movies are made. Not by a filmmaker, but by a think tank. It's no accident that virtually every single Marvel film is devoid of any kind of artistic stamp, because they're not meant to have one. When you watch a Marvel film, Kevin Feige and the Disney suits don't want you to think this is an Edgar Wright movie, or this is a Sam Raimi movie, or this is a Taika Waititi movie. No, they want you to think that this is a Marvel movie, and to cultivate and maintain that kind of brand, over the years they've had to stamp down on writers and directors that have too much of a vision. They want a whole host of directors like John Watts who have shown to be competent enough to direct a real movie in the past and can get done what you want to get done, but at the same time have no issue being essentially a glorified middle manager for the studio that is really the one making the movie. That picture I just showed, that's not him. This is him, except it's not because this is him right here, but actually none of those are him, and if I didn't tell you that, you would never have known, and that's just the kind of director a studio like Marvel wants to have.
Who are these guys?
Now, whatever criticisms you can levy against this brand of filmmaking, if you can even call it that, at the very least, you can say that Marvel has been fairly consistent on this. They've had a few spats with directors here and there, but for the most part, the machine has run fairly smoothly, at least in terms of keeping their directors in line. For the most part, the studio has a plan and an idea of what they want out of a given movie and managed to push it out with minimal issues. But when you look at the Mirror Universe counterpart to the MCU, the now dead and buried DCEU, the same cannot be said. No, the goateed evil version of the MCU was not exactly known for its stability, nor was it known for respecting their directors enough to actually do their job. Which brings me to one David Ayer and the 2016 disaster known as Suicide Squad. No, not James Gunn's 2021 The Suicide Squad. We're talking about the one that no one talks about anymore aside from, ironically enough, David Ayer, which is the reason why I wanted to make this video, because much like most people, I could not care less about Suicide Squad or the prospect of the Ayer cut getting released a la Zack Snyder's Justice League. I mean, my interest in the superhero genre is already hanging by a thread as is, without hollering for director's cuts of terrible forgotten movies from 8 years ago, but I must admit my interest in this topic has peaked recently. Not because I'm now a convert or anything that spends my days harassing WB to release Ayer's cut of the movie. No, I'm still pretty ambivalent on that. But what does fascinate me is how much David Ayer himself seems to talk about it and how all this came to be. It's this bizarre phenomenon that has sprung up in the past 4 or 5 years or so due to Warner Brothers' almost impossibly terrible mismanagement of the DCEU, where during this time their most anticipated and talked about releases were not the new films they were actually making, but the loose promise of re-edits of previously released bungled movies in the canon. It's just so strange, and again, is only a thing because of how terribly the studio ruined these films in the first place.
Kal-El, no!
You don't see fans clamoring for James Gunn's cut of any of the Guardians films or Taika Waititi's cut of the Thor movies, because whatever you can say about how Marvel constricts the artistic vision of their films, at the very least, they allow their directors to, make the movies they are hired to make. But due to this unlikely combination of comical studio incompetence and genuine die-hard fan support, this has been a real topic of discussion speculation for a few years now. There are people who have been asking for the so-called Ayer cut ever since Zack Snyder's Justice League was released back in 2021. And why shouldn't they? I mean, the Snyder cut was at one point nothing more than wishful thinking, but it happened, so why couldn't it happen again? It's not crazy to think it could, but it's been almost 3 years since then, and since James Gunn's soft reboot of The Squad, and most of that momentum has died down. For better or for worse, Gunn and Safran seem to be trying to close the book on that chapter of DC, and seem to be making every move they can to make sure that book stays closed. So, unfortunately for fans hoping to see yet another mythical director's cut, it's likely going to be lost to time. But then there's David Ayer, the director of Suicide Squad, who seems to be as invested as anyone in the potential of his cut getting released to the public. So much so that the man just cannot help himself but talk about it at least a few times a year in interviews and on Twitter. Even during press for his recent film, The Beekeeper, he was asked about it and still seemed to be haunted by the whole experience, saying, "The thing that's been difficult for me is that I made a great film. I made a great film. The people who have seen my cut have pretty much unanimously said that it's one of the best comic book films ever made. If someone who's seen the cut wants to dispute that, then they can come talk to me." Elaborating further, "I was pilloried in the media again and again over it, and then pilloried again and again in the press launch of subsequent IPs, but I kept my mouth shut for years. I learned that nature abhors a vacuum, and if you don't tell your story, then somebody else will. It's incredibly unjust, and I can't point to a similar situation ever. It's mind-blowing, it's a scar, it's a wound, and it's taken a lot out of me. It also took a lot of equity out of my career unfairly."
Hollywood, I tell people, is like watching someone you love get by someone you hate.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'll get to all of it, but these quotes are what drove me to dive a little deeper into this subject, because when you read them, you just can't help but sympathize with him. I mean, this is a man who has clearly not moved on from this experience, and will likely either talk about it himself or be asked about it for the rest of his career. The stain of Suicide Squad will forever follow him no matter what he does in the future. So I can very easily understand why he would be so invested in getting his cut out there, if for no other reason than just the simple catharsis of it. Especially when you see Zack Snyder get his vision completely validated in this full-on 4-hour overly indulgent epic that has since garnered him endless love and praise, and more importantly, completely removed any attachment and responsibility for the theatrical cut of Justice League. Even people like myself, who are not fans of Snyder and his style of filmmaking, don't lay much blame on him for Justice League, because there was this massive crusade to rightfully absolve him of that and shame WB for taking his movie away from him. And now the man has so much clout in the industry that he can pretty much make whatever the fuck he wants with a blank check, even if it's complete garbage. But Ayer has none of that. Sure, there are some diehard fans out there that believe there is a great version of Suicide Squad out there in the ether somewhere, but for one, it's a much smaller community than the release the Snyder Cut crowd, and two, what Ayer said about Suicide Squad damaging his career is true. His name has become synonymous with being a terrible filmmaker almost entirely due to that movie. Now, granted, the man is not beyond criticism and has plenty of other terrible movies and scripts like Bright that you can point to and say that he is not a great filmmaker. Okay, that's not what I'm trying to get at with this. What I am saying is that when people talk about Ayer these days in relation to any new film he's a part of in any way, you will always see comments like, "from the guy who made Suicide Squad," as a way of dismissing the possibility of anything he does being good. His brand is completely tarnished. And again, he's done bad stuff in the past, but before he did Suicide Squad, the man actually had quite a bit of equity in Hollywood. He was coming off 2 very well-received films in End of Watch and Fury. Now, he wasn't out here getting Oscars, but he was seen as a respectable, decent filmmaker, even if most of his films were about more or less the same things. So there's no denying that Suicide Squad did some real and significant damage to his career.
I became the bad guy narratively. Oh, he's a tough director, he's hard to work with, or this or that, right?
But the real question here, and what I find really interesting about his comments on this whole debacle, is how much blame is appropriate to levy against him for the end result of Suicide Squad, and how good would the Ayer cut actually be if it were to be released. I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Because two things can be true at once. The studio could have completely ruined his vision for the movie and saddled him with all the blame, and it's also possible that his cut of the film isn't good either. And that matters because though it sucks, when you make a piece of art, especially something as massive as a blockbuster film, you invite criticism. And if critics and audiences and just the public at large don't like your thing, that's on you, buddy. You kind of have to deal with it. But people in these situations like David Ayer and Zack Snyder and other artists who have had their projects tampered with by studios exist in this odd limbo state where they're both blamed for and completely absolved of the sins of the movie. When you watch a mess like Suicide Squad, you never really 100% know who is responsible for what choice, or what is a reshoot, or what he wanted and what the studio wanted. It's just really hard to judge something like that aside from simply saying it's a mess, because there is no director's stamp or clear vision anywhere in the film. So in a way, Ayer is in this perfect spot where he is seen as a victim of the studio and can claim, as he has many times, that his cut of the movie is quote-unquote one of the greatest comic book films of all time, because at least for right now, no one is ever going to see it. He can say anything about it and no one can dispute it. He can talk about how it was just like Black Hawk Down, or how Harley Quinn and Deadshot hooked up at some point as context for this line.
What, I got a hickey or something?
He can talk about how his version always plays better than the studio version. It's in some ways the best movie he's ever made and could ever make, because who can say otherwise? It's Schrodinger's movie.
It's like Schrodinger's cut now. It's almost like, is it more legendary to see it or more legendary to not see it?
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe he is lying about any of this stuff. In fact, a lot of what he says does add context for the movie that makes it make more sense. I even believe him when he says it's one of the best movies in the entire comic book genre, meaning I believe he believes that, but that also makes me think he's not the best source on this. He has every incentive to say these things to either preserve his reputation or to get his cut out there. So how do we assess what parts of the film he is responsible for, and how could that give us some indication of the quality of his own cut? Well, we know some things. For starters, though I have used Justice League as a comparison for this for obvious reasons, these are two very different situations, at least as far as the levels of studio meddling. You see, with Justice League, there was some desire on the part of WB to lighten the tone, add a few jokes, and give it what they believe to be a more mass market appeal, but Zack Snyder was still making the movie, so it was going to inevitably have his usual dark, edgy, hyper-masculine, borderline homoerotic stuff in there. But due to an incredibly unfortunate, just awful tragedy in Zack Snyder's family, he was forced to step away mid-filming, and the studio used that opportunity to bring in Joss Whedon to rewrite, reshoot, and re-edit much of the movie into this bizarre Frankenstein's monster mishmash of an edgy Zack Snyder film and a cringy, quippy, obnoxious Joss Whedon film.
Like brunch. Like, what is brunch?
So there was some real betrayal there beyond just the usual studio meddling, which is part of the reason why the release the Snyder Cut crowd was so emboldened. Point being, it was a rather exceptional situation that is kind of in a league of its own. It is really hard to screw a director worse than what WB did to him on that film, though that's not to say that David Ayer had it a whole lot easier, just in a different way. You see, Ayer still wrote and directed all the stuff you see in the movie. They didn't hand it over to anyone else. Where the studio screwed him over was in the edit by essentially forcing a square peg into a round hole by cramming in like 1,000 pop songs and more jokes to make it more like movies like Deadpool and Guardians, and less the gritty Snyder-esque movie Ayer intended. And yeah, it certainly comes across that way and is genuinely one of the worst edited films maybe of all time. So right off the bat, we can completely absolve Ayer of the terrible edit because that's been well documented to be a studio choice and what really killed the movie. However, everything else, unfortunate as it may be to say, can in many ways be laid at the feet of David Ayer. Spoiler, I don't think there is a version of Suicide Squad that makes it more watchable aside from just having a cleaner edit. Much as I would love to be wrong on this one, there's just no getting around it. The movie is rotten to the core.
I'm beautiful.
There are some bright spots like Margot Robbie and Viola Davis and Will Smith's usual charismatic self, but everything else from the bland, uninspired costumes and color palette to the just awful performances from people like Jared Leto to the incredibly dumb script that seems almost unreal at times makes it really hard to believe that terrible editing is the only issue at play here.
This is Katana. She's got my back. She can cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
I mean, the way the movie handles Harley Quinn is just so embarrassing.
Normals is setting on the dryer.
Like, I don't think David Ayer is the worst writer in the world. I think he can write his usual riding the line, tough guy, LA cop character well enough, but the man clearly has no idea how to write a woman, and again, it's just so embarrassing. Like, come on man, what is this? I think if he had to describe Harley Quinn as a character, the first thing he would say is hot, and that certainly comes across in the movie.
I say where I want, when I want, with who I want.
So while it is true that a significant amount of context was removed and or shuffled around and then firebombed with pop music, we still have many of the scenes intact and can fairly analyze them in a vacuum. And in a vacuum, this scene is bad, this scene is bad, this scene is bad, this is a terrible line.
So that's it? What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
This is embarrassing. Every scene with Joker is awful. Viola Davis clearly has her finger on this guy's face in this scene. He should blow up. There's so many errors and poor line delivery and uninspired action sequences. You can't tell me that all this is supposedly fixed with a simple director's cut.
We're the bad guys.
Now, I'll grant you that re-editing it in a linear fashion would do a ton of work as far as making the film make sense, but the fact that it is edited so terribly in this strange roundabout way does kind of blind people from a lot of the core issues at play, because it gives them this idea that it's this single white whale, that if we only did this one thing, we would have limitless potential. But like, have you seen the scenes? Do you mean to tell me that all those are going to be taken out? That Jared Leto is suddenly not going to be terrible? That the film will suddenly not look like visual puke? That Harley Quinn will be an actual character beyond her not having pants? I don't know, man. Doesn't seem likely. Like, the main thing you always hear about what would supposedly be fixed in the Ayer cut is the character introductions and backstories, because in the theatrical cut, they basically machine gun rapid fire those off one after another in the first like 5 minutes. So that's certainly true, again, in that it would make the film make more sense to spread those out over the course of the entire movie, but it's yet another example of people completely ignoring the deeper issues with those. Yes, they're edited terribly and could have been done better, but the greater issue is that they exist at all. You don't need to have chunks of the movie where you cut away to scenes showing 100 different characters' backstories. That can be done better and more efficiently in the dialogue and character interactions. This is done perfectly in a film like Guardians of the Galaxy, where they show one central character's backstory in great detail with Star-Lord and let us know about other characters like Rocket and Drax and Gamora by how they interact with others, certain shots like this, emotional outbursts, choices they make, you know, like a movie. Those go so much further in terms of letting the audience know who a character is than simply cutting to a literal origin story. That's just bloat and doesn't really tell us much at all about a character. take El Diablo for example. The one good scene of the movie where they're all in the bar and he explains why he doesn't like using his powers because of what happened to his family is great and gives context as to why he is the way he is, but they then immediately ruin it by cutting to this terrible scene where you actually see it happen, and he even does the like look up to the sky and yell no bit. We don't need to see any of that shit. Him explaining and us imagining is a strong enough visual, and a movie about a Suicide Squad going on a mission should be contained to just that, not 7 other mini subplots that explain why Harley Quinn has bleached skin. Like, I think the Deadshot daughter thing works for him, but all these other assholes can be explored via the events of the movie. If you want an even better example of this, just look at the other Suicide Squad film. That movie is so focused on the actual mission and includes 0 flashback sequences aside from this one bit with Ratcatcher 2 that comes at this perfect emotional moment, and yet every single character is not only extremely well fleshed out, but likable. Not because we see or even know all their backstories, but just by these simple character interactions and cute moments like this.
I'm a superhero!
And all without scenes of fucking Batman or the Joker or the Flash or previous jobs that show us gunman can shoot gun good. That's the main flaw at the core of the movie. The script penned by Ayer is extremely bloated and unfocused and seems to have more interest in going over things like the Joker and Harley Quinn's origins than it does the actual Suicide Squad mission. These are all things that would not only be included in the Ayer cut, but likely even longer and more overindulgent than they already were.
Own that shit.
Now, I don't want to be totally unfair to David Ayer here, because despite all I've said and do believe about this movie and his limitations as a filmmaker, I do actually enjoy many of his movies, and I think his gritty, in-the-muck, cops and robbers brand does apply well to a thing like Suicide Squad, much more so than I think a director like Zack Snyder does to Superman, so I think under the right circumstances, he could make a decent version of this material. And again, I don't doubt his cut would be superior to the theatrical one, but the bottom line is, there's just not much to be saved here. It doesn't really matter if he or the studio is more at fault for each individual aspect of the movie, because the end result doesn't leave much that can be fixed. The script is awful and bloated and dumb. The cast is decent, but none of them have anything to work with. The main villain, with or without Joker involved, is as bad as any terrible superhero movie villain you can think of. It's also held back by being PG-13, which robs it of any real grit and teeth and, fun. None of this has anything to do with the edit. It's all baked in there and leads me to believe that a real Ayer cut doesn't really exist. Yes, there is a cut out there that he would much rather have his name on, but there is no version of this that would feel like an actual David Ayer movie. Go watch his other stuff, both good and bad, and you'll see his distinct style. It's fast-paced and bloody and gross and grimy and violent and dumb, but dumb in a way that can actually work sometimes. None of that is in the DNA of Suicide Squad. What is there is just bleh. And if you told me it was directed by fucking Brett Ratner, I wouldn't know otherwise. Like all these studios that run cinematic universes, they don't allow any directors, save for a couple exceptions like James Gunn and Zack Snyder, to imprint their styles onto their movies. So I think something unique and exceptional like Zack Snyder's Justice League has tricked all of us into believing that there are these supposed hidden gems out there that don't actually exist. It's like if people were clamoring for a Sam Raimi cut of Doctor Strange 2, as if you could possibly cut that into something that would in any way resemble a Sam Raimi film. I mean, I do admire and love that people are so ready these days to defend directors from all these soul-sucking awful studios. That's awesome, and I genuinely hope that that leads to more writers and directors getting the chance to make their shit with less tampering. But the reality is, Suicide Squad 2016 is not something that can be saved, and frankly, for the sake of David Ayer, is better left unreleased, because the last thing that poor man needs after all these years and all the abuse he's taken is for all of us to realize that his cut ain't so good either.
Her heart's out! We can end this!